by creating something new that has value between the care partners, you're making care into a generative, positive experience. And you're saying that both care partners have the capacity, the ability to make something together, something new and valuable together.
Welcome to Healing Together. I'm Deirdre Tomlinson. Today I'm talking to Anne Basting, whose new book, Creative Care, A Revolutionary Approach to Dementia and Elder Care, shows that populations with long-term cognitive disabilities can be cared for in new and more gratifying ways than previously understood. Her unique approach to working with people who suffer from dementia and other age-related cognitive impairments has challenged conventional wisdom and resulted in extraordinary changes for patients and caregivers alike. We discuss storytelling, relationships, and play, and moments from her mom's own experience with dementia. Talking with Anne, I started to understand how caring for our elders can be a fully reciprocal relationship, including creativity, joy, and what she calls beautiful questions. Without further delay, here is my conversation with Anne Basting. So to get started, I'd love to frame the concept of creative care and the seeds for your work in a particular story that you share in your book. You had just recently completed a PhD, and through that process extensively researched the burgeoning senior theater movement, and you'd witnessed yourself the transformative power that the performing arts can hold for older adults. But my understanding is that in all the shows you'd attended in that time, you hadn't seen a single performer on stage in a wheelchair, and only one using a cane, which kind of raised the question for you of whether theater could be as transformative for those with serious cognitive or physical difficulties. To that end, you'd been conducting postdoctoral research at the Marian Franciscan Center in Milwaukee, really attempting to bring those two worlds together. So with that explanation, I will just let you read.
In week 7 of my volunteering mission, I again willed myself out of the car, through the urine curtain, up the stairs, and into the common room, bringing with me a big pad of paper, a few markers, and a picture torn out of a magazine. The iconic profile of the Marlboro Man under an enormous Stetson. Rather than ask them to remember stories of their own lives, which had inevitably led to blank stares and which I gave up weeks ago, I asked them to imagine. I introduced myself again to my 4 faithful elders gathered around a table. This week, I say, let's just make up a story, any story. You can say anything and I'll write it down. Pointing to the picture of the Marlboro Man and feeling a little ridiculous, I ask, what do you want to name him? One of them musters a soft, I don't know. I don't know either. You can just make it up, I reassure them. Pause. I try again. What do you think is a good name for him? Any name you want. One of the elders lifts his head slightly and says, Fred. A surge of joy rushes through me. This is the most response we've had in 6 weeks. This one-syllable name feels like a miracle. Fred who? Fred Astaire, says another gentleman. Someone chuckles, and the miracle is doubled. Where do you want to say he is, I ask. There's a long, thoughtful moment of quiet. Oklahoma, someone says. And a woman breaks the C curve, lifts her head, and softly and slowly sings, Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain. We are all shocked. More heads lift. What is Oklahoma like? Am I pushing it, I wonder? There are lots of skinny rivers and skinny trees. Is he married? I decide to roll with it as long as I can. Yes. To whom, I ask. Gina Autry. Okay, now that's just plain funny. I can't stop smiling now, suspended in a moment that truly feels like a miracle. It's hard to catch my breath. I repeat what they had said so far to make sure they stay close to the heart of the story they are creating. So here we have Fred Astaire. He's married to Gina Autry. They live in Oklahoma. We take a moment to sing Oklahoma again, where there are lots of skinny rivers and skinny trees. Eventually, between my questions and their responses, we create a world in which Fred and Gina work in the rodeo. He does calf roping. She does barrel riding. They can't be in the same event because she's better than he is. They don't have any kids. They don't have any time. They tend black and white cows who say, "Hi, Pat." And they have 3 dogs, Bozo, Sandy, and ABCDEFG. And they will have a big Christmas dinner on a white lace tablecloth with candles. They will eat goose. The story is funny, thoughtful, and peppered with what I'm sure are details drawn from real life, along with their playful imaginations and the residue of whatever disease is snarling their synapses. The common room and its chaos melt away. The storytellers and I are looking at one another, eyes shining. And then we notice that there are people standing around us. They appear to be staff. Their eyes are shining too. They look like they might be, jealous? Clearly they want to play too. I thank everyone profusely. It's incredible how hard the elders worked for nearly 45 minutes. They answered every one of my silly questions. They came out and played with me and with one another. It was a gift.
Thank you for reading that. There's such a feeling of magic in that story, and truly in many of the stories that you share in your book as well. There's really a spellbinding quality because they're so beautifully written, but also because there's a feeling of magic anytime we can't see how something will work out, and then it does, where two seemingly contradictory things come together. And that seems to hold true, especially in the comment you make in the very first chapter of your book that, quote, "joy and meaning can coexist in some of the hardest times of our lives," end quote. And I wonder if it's more than just the fact that they can coexist. I think in some ways they have to. The tough and the rewarding things have to go together. I'm thinking of a quotation from Brené Brown that says, "We cannot selectively numb emotions. When we numb the painful emotions, we also numb the positive emotions." And so I see that as suggesting that there's a risk of missing out on the joy if you aren't willing to sit with the pain as well, if you aren't willing to show up for the tough things. I'm curious if you've seen that play out in your work.
I think in this situation, it might be a little reversed. In the situation that I've been used to working in, places where we accumulate and sort of only imagine loss, the painful emotions are what's felt. And in fact, kind of the opposite, that we have to train ourselves to think that it's okay to feel playfulness and whimsy and the positive emotions in the places that feel almost like solemn for their seriousness of acknowledging and honoring loss, but that it doesn't undermine that at all to tell a joke in a nursing home, to invite people into playfulness, or even if people are really at the very end of their lives on hospice, to really bring light and joy and to feel that, and that it's okay to do that. I think the people themselves experiencing it know that, but that, people who are like, well, nursing homes are just depressing, I don't want to go visit, or I don't want to volunteer, or I don't want to work there. They're the ones, I think, that need to open their minds to it being okay to have that dual emotional nature of that part of our lives.
I think there's also sort of a coming together and a duality, even in the title of your book, in the words creative and care. There's a dichotomy there. I'm curious if you can share what those words mean individually and what they mean together when they come together.
Yeah, I mean, it was so interesting because I've always brought them together in my own practice, in my own life, as an artist working with older adults and people with disabilities. But then when I started carefully pulling them apart and thinking about them, I realized just how almost oxymoron, it was to have the two words together. that creativity really has been defined as generative, as making something. And the definition that I use after a lot of research was really drawn from multiple sources. They all the definitions seem to land on something new that has value that's added to the world. And that means you're generating something new, whether or not it's just a rearrangement of things in a novel way. And the idea that it has value can be just personal to you, or societal, or communal value. So it's seen as this positive thing that comes out of it's added, it's valuable, it's special, and it's positive. So care, on the other hand, has really been posited as almost like this model that I use in the book. This example is like the empty vessel approach to care, where one person is kind of empty and the other person, it's their job to fill them back up, to make them whole, to help care for them, to heal them. And the danger in that model is that the person providing the care can empty themselves in the process. And so that's how we get this terminology around caregiver burden or caregiver burnout. You're giving too much of yourself to this other person who has needs and is experiencing loss. So by bringing the two together, it sort of invites us to imagine care in a different way, so that care becomes reimagined as generative, and creativity becomes reimagined as relational, when the concept that we usually have is of this kind of creative solo genius artist working on their own. But really, we know that creativity happens out of feedback from multiple people usually. So creativity becomes relational and care becomes generative when you bring the two together.
There's a concept conveyed in your book, and for which you actually give credit to anthropologist Barbara Meyerhoff, that, quote, stories are actually shaped in the relationship between teller and listener. And as you say, much of your work has been to create tools that can bring people into deeper relationships with one another. Is it perhaps actually relationships themselves that create meaning in our lives? And is creative care successful because it is simply one example or one way of engaging in relationship with others? Is it a way of diving into that relational interaction?
I do think that our lives are made meaningful in relationship. But I also think that not all relationships will be generative. I think some relationships can be depleting as well, and those are more toxic relationships. So I don't think it's the nature of being in relationship solely that adds meaning to our lives. It might be a negative meaning, but if we're talking about generative, positive relationships, that's the creative part of it. That something new of value is made in the relationship. So I think it's a matter of describing the value of the relationship. If it's generative, yes. If it's depleting or a negative, no.
Maybe you're sort of directing us towards this question of, I guess, reciprocity in care. And to quote a line from your website, you say, creativity and reciprocity need to be positioned at the center of every care relationship and care system. And you've already brought up the concept of the empty vessel model of caregiving. But I'm wondering if you can tell us a little more about that and contrast that with a reciprocal model of caregiving. What is the risk of the empty vessel model?
I think the empty vessel model, the risk is that it takes the agency and the value away from the person experiencing care. they become a passive recipient of service when they really still have a lot to contribute and add to other people. By shifting the care relationship to reciprocal, you're saying that the care partners on both sides can nourish and feed each other, fuel each other and help each other and give to each other, so that it doesn't make it less hard of work, but it makes it meaningful and appreciated and valued. I share in the book the story of my mom and my father who's caring for her. And I had the incredible fortune of kind of being around the corner and watching as my mom reached out for him and held his hands and said, have I told you how much I appreciate everything you're doing for me? And he kind of welled up and said, yes, you have, but I love hearing it. He really appreciated it. And it made a big difference for him to feel that generosity coming back to him. I think that makes a big difference.
That's a beautiful story and a beautiful moment. I wonder, for those who are listening who are already in an elder caregiving situation, or for those who might be worriedly anticipating the eventuality of caring for parents or spouses, is there a way that we can shift into that reciprocal model? And for those who are anticipating it, perhaps even find joy in thinking about what might be to come.
Well, I think a lot of what the different chapters, and especially in the second section of the book, are about just these frameworks and tools that you can use to kind of think through and prepare yourself for a care relationship. Improvisation. There's a chapter on yes and, where you observe everything around you, you accept it. And that's a big part of what we're not good at. We tend to deny disability and aging and almost treat it like it's not natural or normal to have frailty in late life, or to have changes in cognition, to be interdependent. Those are normal, and we can accept those as a given and then figure out how you could build on it positively, how you can say yes and. So accepting what's given to you in a moment and then adding to it in a positive way. What can you do? That's one whole chapter with examples. And then there's asking beautiful questions, which is in a given moment looking around and allowing curiosity to inspire you to wonder something. Beautiful questions open up a moment into exploration and discovery, and you can answer them in any way. So you're inviting the person you're caring for into learning and expression. I'm trying to think of an example. My father just told me one. Gosh, what did he do? It was so great. I can't remember whether I used this example in the book or not, so it'll be a little scavenger hunt if you read it. My father and mother had gone out to dinner with good friends and had just a wonderful evening. And they got home, and Mom's routine when they ate at home was to set the table. So she started setting the table, and she said, are you ready for dinner? I'm setting the table. And instead of getting upset, he figured out what question he could ask. And he asked her, are you hungry now? And she said, no, we already ate dinner, didn't we? He said, yes. And so there was no anger at that lapse. There was just a beautiful question that opened up an expression between them. And finding ways to do that so that you don't get mad at the gaps, but that you use the gaps to open up wonder and curiosity. And in so doing, you're opening up emotional communication.
There's so much I want to ask here. I want to go more into the topic of beautiful questions, but before we get there, what I'm hearing in your story here and in your words is that these are lessons for everyone, regardless of our cognitive ability. That to be in a strong relationship, in a generative relationship, it's helpful sometimes, at least I find this, that it's helpful to let go of assumptions, or let go of, this is how it was last time when I had dinner with this person or had a conversation with them. This is how they engaged with me. Kind of let go of the expectations that the way something was is how it will always be. There's this need to sort of invite in or let go of possibilities. And I'm curious, in the work that you're doing with people who have lost so much of their cognitive capacity, is that giving you insights into things that apply to all of us, ways that we can all show up differently?
I think, I have a good friend that I've been doing this work with for a really long time who puts it this way. She says, I say I go to therapy once a week, but it just happens to be that my therapists live in a nursing home. When you go and do this work, whether it's family work, now in my own family, or whether I come in as a total stranger, as a one-time volunteer or a repeating volunteer, or an artist training a care community, this work teaches you to be fully immersed in the present moment with people. And the power of the yes and in that moment is being very observant about where people are in that given moment. And I use that in the classroom as a teacher. I use that parenting. I use that being a daughter. I use that being a spouse and a friend. It's just informative for human relationship. And I learned it, from nursing homes. And the thing about Alzheimer's and dementia and people with profound disabilities is that almost every second of every day is different. You don't know from one visit to the next if someone's going to engage. So I've taken to saying in this work, when I'm training and doing projects, I say to people, just never stop inviting. Like don't be like bossy about it, but always check in and invite someone. And teachers do this too, because you don't know what some of the students are going through on a given day. And just check in and find out, is everything okay? Can you answer this question? Or can I help you in some way? Because I think, every moment is different in life for all of us.
Yeah. I think we talk to ourselves in a way so poorly. I kind of wish that we did with ourselves what you were just describing. Check in and say, hey, here's an invitation. Tell me how you're feeling. What's going on in there? So jumping to the concept of beautiful questions, which you brought up, you explained that there is no right or wrong answer to a beautiful question. Mm-hmm. There's only exploration and expression. And you shared an example of a beautiful question that your dad invited your mom to answer recently. And I'm curious if you could share a few other examples to help paint the picture of what a beautiful question is.
There's characteristics of them that I've come to understand now as we've really created, probably 50, 100 of them at this point. And you can find them on the TimeSlips.org website in the Creativity Center. There's a whole section just on beautiful questions. And there's also a Creative Care Imagination Kit that will be available hopefully later in 2020. that will have 25 beautiful questions and 25 image prompts and a little journal for people to use. So, you can learn by the example of some existing ones. Some of the favorite moments of beautiful questions and examples that I've experienced have been, what do you treasure in your home and why? And this is a great example of kind of the approach of the beautiful questions, which is inviting people to think, especially now in this moment of quarantine when everybody's kind of at home, looking at your surroundings a little differently and imagining your relationship to them a little differently. So something you treasure that's around you and why it is that you treasure that thing. And there's always stories behind that, which is great. And that's often what people share. It also doesn't say the most. Sometimes we use it because it's hard not to. But what is the most valuable thing in your home? It's not the question, but what do you treasure? Which can be something that has no monetary value or a lot of monetary value. Treasure is more emotional. And a story of what someone said, one of my students a couple students were working with a woman just as companionship visits. And they asked her that question and she said, her oven. And the students were a little baffled by anyone who could treasure an oven. But it turns out they learned that she had always baked for her family and her neighbors. And she hadn't baked in years. And so from that single question just came a lovely couple of sessions with her visits where they asked her about her favorite recipes and got the ingredients and then tested out the oven. It still worked. And then they baked these cookies and shared them with the Meals on Wheels drivers as a thank you. So in the same way that she had been able to bake and be generous before, she was able to do that again.
Can you say more about most? What's the issue with using most in questions?
Well, the challenging thing about most is that it's a little less accessible to people with cognitive challenges, because when you say, what is a time you've laughed the most in your life? So that is asking a person with cognitive disabilities to think of every single moment in their life that they've laughed, compare them all, and then pick one that was the time that they laughed the most. Whereas if you switch that question to, what makes you laugh? You don't have to do that. You just have one step. So it's a little bit more accessible to someone experiencing cognitive challenges. And you can usually feel the difference in those questions when a person will just pause and you can feel them get lost in the process. And you can repeat the question. Sometimes that helps the person through. But you can also just change the way you've worded it. Just rephrase it slightly to eliminate a couple of those steps to make the person feel more successful in the process.
I was going to ask if you notice that you have maybe lost someone, if you could just rephrase the question, or if that exacerbates the problem because now you've asked them two questions.
I often rephrase, but I'll do it kind of slowly, and there's other techniques that TimeSlips has an online training that goes through a lot of different communication techniques. I don't cover all those in the book, but you want to use multiple communication tools to reinforce the communication. So always make sure you're facing the person, you have eye contact, you're at their level, you're right at eye level. You can use hand gestures. Speak so that you can be heard, because oftentimes you've also got hearing challenges as well as cognitive challenges. The baffling thing to me is like in nursing homes or assisted living, it's really classic to see someone talking to someone while they're pushing them in a wheelchair or talk to them from behind. Mm-hmm. Who is that person? I don't know that person. I think they're talking to me. I'm not sure. It can be so disorienting. So that simple device of just making sure you're facing the person at eye level and speaking clearly and loud, not obnoxiously loudly, but making sure you're heard makes a big difference.
Got it. Thank you for the very tactical example there. I think that's really helpful. I want to ask sort of along the lines actually of infusing creativity into care through things like beautiful questions. There's a link here as well with meaningfulness. And there's another story I'd love to have you read that feels like it connects these concepts of creativity and meaningfulness and beautiful questions. And it's the example of how meaning was infused into a very simple coupon clipping activity. So I'm wondering if you can explain the context of the think tank that you organized and read this story for us.
Sure. So I was really lucky when I was directing the Center on Age and Community at the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee to have some funding to support what we called next step think tanks. So I got to pull together sort of my fantasy dinner party of artists whose work I really admired in community and heads of aging and disability services organizations. We were gathering for what I call the think tank on how can we radically transform activities in long-term care. And one of the things we did was look at this list of activities, and that's what I describe in this little passage here that I'll read. One of the ideas that sprang from the group of artists and aging services professionals was inspired by an activity that one of the attendees, an activity staff member from an area day center, had actually done. At the time, the Alzheimer's Association's list of 101 recommended activities included clipping coupons. This might sound dreadfully boring and devoid of meaning to some people, but growing up in the Midwest, I knew firsthand both the pleasure in frugality and tradition and the need that drives this deep-seated ritual. Here's how this particular coupon clipping activity unfolded. A group of elders gathered around a table with brightly colored newspapers and magazines. Staff invited the elders to find coupons that drew their attention and to share stories about them. What was it about the product that drew them? Did they use it? Did the product remind them of something they used? Or had they never used the product and were drawn to it by its foreignness? Whatever the reason, the facilitator invited them to share a story about the product in the coupon. Chicken pot pie? Laundry detergent? Batteries? Together, the elders carefully wrote their stories on sturdy sheets of paper and cut them with pinking shears to create an unusual border. Then the group picked a local grocery store and arranged a trip to the store in the day center van. Together, the elders boarded the van with wheelchairs and walkers, with stories, coupons, and tape. When they got to the store, they unloaded and broke into teams, each team taking a coupon, a story, and some tape. The teams walked the aisles in search of the product featured in their coupon. When they found it, they taped the story and the coupon to the shelf, and then, without a word, found their way back to the van. The elders had left anonymous gifts of story and coupons, paying it forward to unsuspecting neighbors.
Thank you for reading that. I love that story. There's something a little bit like a flash mob about it, or like a heist, which I just find so lovely. Can you share how that story connects with key aspects of meaningfulness, fun, goal-oriented, having value and connection to others?
Yeah, I think that story is just a great example of all the elements of meaningfulness, of self-expression through story and pleasure. It was a lot of fun. Rigor, because you're learning and growing. And then the final one is being connected to the larger world. And I think that's another thing, part of the empty vessel misnomer of care is that that model tends to take away the older person's, I think, right to be generous and of use to their neighbors and their community. So opening up that channel again, letting them give gifts to people, enabling them to give gifts to people is really meaningful.
Someone that we recently interviewed as a guest on this podcast, who is a geriatrician, brought up the notion of safety and how our concern about safety for elders often ends up creating constraints that might diminish their quality of life, or things like meaningfulness. And it seems to be a social contract that we're in right now, but we might be extending lives at the cost of making them less meaningful, less worth living.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think care settings tend to be framed solely in medical terms, and they're all about reducing risk. And also really, in order to be kind of financially viable, they have to do things at scale. And so the institution becomes the priority and not the individual. And so you've got this horrible toxic combination of prioritizing the institution, reducing risk and individual agency. And that is, I think, what is so soul-sucking when people go into settings like that. They feel as though all of their individuality is taken away. They are not places of meaning and culture making. And creativity is all about risk, bringing new elements together. You don't know actually what is going to come out. So a lot of our work feels radical. When I say the TimeSlips trainings that we do, infusing creativity into care settings, because we're infusing the unknown. We're infusing risk into daily life again. We're infusing playfulness, and then using that matrix of meaningfulness to create spaces in which you're not just waiting to die. You're not just doing an activity for its individual therapeutic benefit. You are making legacy. You're collaborating and forming friendships and building community. You are making meaning and culture in a place where people happen to be at the end of their lives.
It seems that one of the most important challenges in long-term care settings is that people are incredibly lonely, but at the same time, these folks are mostly people's parents and grandparents, meaning they're someone's parent or grandparent. And no one would wish that loneliness on their loved ones. I'm just curious what you feel causes us to turn away from people that we love in these settings, and whether that individuality and creativity is the thing that we can bring to those settings in a way that actually makes the interaction and the experience of your time there more joyful and enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of all of the work we do with students. We have, I've been for years training high school and college age students through service learning to learn the techniques of creative care and to invite stories, just like the Marlboro Man process. The thing is, we have such negative attitudes as a society and about going in like, oh, it's going to be so depressing, going in and doing storytelling with people with dementia in a nursing home. And I tell you, because it's a generative process, because it allows for an avenue for meaningful expression and generosity and creativity, it is so playful and joyful that the students benefit just as much as the older adults. And that can change the way we think about aging in our own lives. It can change the way we handle aging in our own families. And it also may very well open up career opportunities that otherwise stigma and prejudice might have shut off to people. With the aging population boom, we need more people to go into the field of aging. And we still have these stigmas that I think the number is somewhere like 3% of social work students say they want to go into working with older adults in gerontology. when what we need is 97% of them to say they do. So we need to, these techniques can also be really helpful for the workforce problem, that you can feel it now that we have, we're straining our care systems to work with older adults in this moment of COVID, but it is always there. This prejudice keeps us from wanting to go into the field.
So there's a desire not to go into the field, and I guess I would say most of us don't spend our lives working with people who are in steep cognitive decline. And for many of us, I think that can be a terrifying prospect. But you are swimming in these waters all the time. How do you think that has affected your view of your own life and aging process and potential cognitive decline?
Well, everyone's fantasy is that they stay as they recognize themselves now. They have the power to take care of themselves and to contribute to the world all the way to the end, or that they have what we call kind of a concentration of morbidity, so that the period at the end of your life where you're ill is very narrow. That's the fantasy. But that's not the reality. Very few people experience that. I mean, it'd be great if we all could. And the healthcare system is getting better at, I think, pain treatment and things like that, which is great. So it's not, you don't set out to deliberately think of the end of your life in that way. And I think that a lot of what I'm hoping is through teaching, through writing these books, by doing trainings in care settings, that I'm helping in my own way to transform these environments and to push for more options and to create a greater sense of understanding, so that if I ever do get to a situation like that, which is probably likely, that my own family is aware of more nourishing mutual ways to care, and that the care settings maybe by that time will have improved some.
What are health and well-being to you? And are they different, and how?
Well, I'm with the World Health Organization, that in their definition that doesn't separate them, that health is not just the absence of disease, but of thriving from where you are. In fact, the students that we work with in the spring every year, we have what's called the Flourish Festival. People should aim to flourish, even with losses. We can rise to the fullness of who we are in a given moment. And that's a great way to have a goal to invite someone that you're caring for into flourishing.
If there were a single activity that most families who have a relative in long-term care or isolated at home could incorporate into their schedules, something that most people don't do but wouldn't be a very heavy lift and that would make a big difference to them and their loved one, what would that be?
I think creating a moment for imagination each day, and it doesn't have to be the same. There's so many different ways to do it. You can be passing a window and just stop and imagine the sounds you hear out the window and make those sounds yourself. That's the playful part. You can be sitting at the kitchen table and looking at the fruit bowl and write a poem out of, what are the smells of the fruit? What are the colors of the fruit? What is a feeling you have about the fruit? And then just putting those in order and then using the name of the fruit as the end. That's a poem that you can create at the kitchen table. You can echo movements of things that you see. There's just so many ways for everyday moments to become little enchantments. Passing a picture that you otherwise pass every day and suddenly making up a story about it instead.
Enchantments is such a wonderful word. And in all of those examples, they seem to illustrate a lot of presence. in any of those examples, you're being so present in the moment, which is obviously not what we're doing when we're sort of living in our head or telling stories. And this is a personal question that's only maybe tangentially related to your work, but since I have you here, I'm going to ask your perspective. I feel like I'm in a period of my life where I'm actually learning that I don't always need to tell stories or explain everything. And I think it can sometimes feel painful not to have a reason to explain something that happened, but there's also freedom in letting go of the pressure to come up with the story behind something. And so much of your work is about telling stories. So I'm curious, is there a time and a place for stories? Do we sometimes just not need them? Or are there sort of multiple definitions of stories here?
Well, I just finished teaching a whole semester of a storytelling class, so I can give you the storytelling 101. Story, to me, I use the most broad definition. And the purpose of story, like story is just essential to human life. Story is how we remember things. We order events into a narrative so that we can make sense of what happens to us, and that we can share what happens to us with other people. And those people might be in your house. They might be the next generation. So, and you might be trying to explore what happened or bring alive people who are no longer with us. So story is a little bit of time travel, like sending stories into the future or unearthing or covering stories from the past. It's how we make ourselves understood to ourselves and to others, and how we understand life. So story is just, it's a necessary thing for human consciousness, in other words. And then how we choose to do it is another thing entirely. And some people, I wrote in a different book about people who were obsessively trying to capture every memory, almost as though the human mind was being compared to a machine. It's like wearing a camera and constantly taking in data and thinking that that would help people with dementia, because then they could just call it up. But it doesn't have the same function. It's not woven into meaning and narrative. So that is the work that we're doing. Through storying, we're giving it meaning by turning it into narrative and story. And the structures of narrative and story can be totally different. You can do it through movement. You can do it through sound, music, image, word. Those are all the tools we have for creating story. And you can use, the Neil Gaiman, and then that's all you need for story. This happened, and then that happened. That you're putting two things in order in, that something happened and then something else happened. So that very, very loose definitions around what story is and how it's structured.
Yeah, and I absolutely feel the desire to create that narrative, which you described as being pretty central to humans and human life. So I definitely resonate with that. I think my current lesson is maybe just learning how to not construct stories about everything, knowing when it's called for and when it's not. I wonder what lesson is front and center for you right now. What are you finding matters most right now in your journey?
I think I'm back at the core of it, which is the present moment. And there's a lot of cultural incentives pulling you out of the present and being productive, making something, doing something, being active, forward motion. And there's such beauty in just immersing yourself in the moment and the preciousness of the people around you and the exchanges. And to me, that's where I fell in love with creativity. And for me, storytelling is having fun making things together. You're creating experiences together in that way. And Somehow in this moment of a lot of, staying home and the kids are home and this desire to reach out to parents if you're not able to physically be with them, is to find ways to invite each other into play and meaning making. You can really feel that we yearn for that right now. And that feels important to remember.
May I ask you just a few more rapid fire questions?
Sure.
Okay. What's the top misunderstanding about dementia that you hear or see people express?
I'd say that the top misunderstanding is that they're empty shells, that there's nothing there. People can live with this condition for 15 years, and there's all kinds of ups and downs, and it's a long, gradual process. We really do ourselves a disservice by assuming they're not there.
What's the most important thing to remember or keep in mind about dementia and cognitive decline?
That there are strengths that remain that you can build on, that you can find and connect with the person emotionally. You can invite them into play and meaning making, and that you have something to learn from them.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Aside from your book and your nonprofit TimeSlips, what are your top recommendations for educating oneself about bringing creativity to caregiving?
I don't know. I think I wrote this because
you're the source.
So much of the dementia stuff is about symptoms and trying to get people to donate for the cure. There's just not enough work in giving people positive tools for engagement. The memory cafe movement is hopeful to me, where people are creating social structures that are positive so that we don't have stigma and that people can try to stay home with it and find neighbors and supportive friends.
Okay, so speaking of doing this work, bringing creativity to elders, what is your favorite beautiful question?
I think my favorite beautiful question is, if you could fly anywhere right now, where would you go?
What is a favorite book that you've read on any topic recently? Assuming you've had some time to read, maybe not.
So I usually just like whatever book I'm reading. And right now I'm reading Anne Patchett's new novel, The Dutch House.
What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night is trying to figure out how all of the resources that we have that can help so many people right now, how we can get them out to more people.
And what are your top habits that keep you feeling centered and healthy?
I go for a run almost every day, and almost every day I try to get over across the street to spend a little time looking at the horizon across Lake Michigan.
Beautiful. I do the same here in Seattle, looking out at the sound. Well, thank you for speaking with me today. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
Take care.
You too, Anne. Healing Together is produced by Health and Lee. Our theme song is Ramble, composed and performed by Ed Morneau.